In this video, I'm going to show you how I repainted this Dracula model. Now, this isn't the classic version of the suave and menacing Count. This version of Dracula comes from a 1948 comedy classic with some subtle changes. So let's get started as we inject some new blood into a tired old vinyl model.
Count Dracula sleeps in this coffin, but rises every night at sunset. Chick is right. This is awful silly stuff. Dracula.
Fans of Bela Lugosi know he played Dracula on Broadway hundreds of times, but only twice in the movies. The 1931 Universal classic,
I am Dracula,
and 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
All right, I'm coming.
There are a few subtle costume differences. On the stage, Lugosi's cape was lined in purple. This kit from Billiken that I bought secondhand came painted that way. In the original movie, the cape's lining was gray, and in Abbott and Costello, the lining was gold. And that's the color I'm going to use, since my plan is to eventually use this kit as part of an Abbott and Costello diorama. The capes from the play and the original film appear to have been made of wool or another matte material. There's little, if any, light reflecting off the cape, while the cape in the Abbott and Costello movie has a definite satin sheen. And a bonus, the portrait on the Billiken model looks more like Lugosi later in life when he shot the Abbott and Costello movie. The first step is to get all the old paint off, because this old guy looks like he's down for the count. I disassembled the kit. Fortunately, the previous owner hadn't glued it, and vinyl is a relatively soft material, so it was easy to pry apart. And I'm starting with a short rest in a purple coffin of sorts, a bath in Castrol Super Clean. After soaking for about an hour, I use an old toothbrush and an old nail brush to get the kit back to its original bare vinyl. Now that all the old paint is off, it's almost time to reassemble, but first, a couple of things about these older vinyl kits. First, they are very soft. You can see that they compress very easily. And so, because they compress and because they can sag over time, it's important, especially at the base, that you fill it. Now, fortunately, the previous owner had filled this with resin, so it's quite solid and it will stand easily on its own. If you haven't done that with an older vinyl kit, it may sag over time. One of the other things is that the previous owner didn't use glue, and so when you reassemble it, it was easy to pull apart, but when you reassemble it, you'll see that there's quite a bit of a gap. Now that's going to have to be addressed. Even though the cape will cover over that gap, if the cape is taken off, and it is made to be removable, you will have a line here across the tuxedo jacket. I don't want that, so I'm going to fill it so that it blends seamlessly. So now it's time to putty, and for that I'll be using my favorite putty filler for problems like this, AV's Epoxy Sculpt. With the torso and the legs now glued together, it's time to use the epoxy putty to mask this gap right at the halfway point, right at the waist. So you use equal parts of the A and B and mix them together, and then it's ready to apply. I'm also going to be using AV's safety solvent, which helps smooth out and blend in the putty. Now that the AV's has been applied, it has to dry, and once it's dried, it'll be sanded down, the kit will be primed and painted, and you won't even know that there was a seam there. While I was fixing that, I noticed that there were some air bubbles, especially in the hem of the cape, so those were filled in as well, and those will have to dry. And I also noticed that there was an odd air bubble or two between the knuckles on one of the hands, so that's been filled in. So all of this now has to dry before it can be primed and painted. And here it is after it's been primed. Now, I opted to go with a black primer because the bulk of the tuxedo is in black. However, I did use white, especially for the shirt, the vest, the tie, and the inside of the cape. I don't want to have to fight against the black primer when I'm painting other colors, so I opted for lighter colors. The inside of the cape is going to be a gold, as mentioned earlier, and I like to go with a cream for the vest, a stark white for the shirt, and maybe a cream for the bow tie. So that was why I opted for those painting choices. For the hands and the head, I also primed in white. Most of the color for the flesh is going to be coming through glazes, as I've mentioned in other videos. And so we'll get to that process soon. Now that I've got the cream colored vest masked, it's time to spray in the white of the shirt. I don't really care about the bow tie so much. I can always paint that back in as a creamy color if I like. I'm still undecided whether I'm going to use a creamy color or if I'm going to use a bright white for the tie. I also don't mind if I get overspray on the jacket or on the rest of the tuxedo because black covers everything. Now that the shirt and the tie have been spray painted white, everything has been sealed. I'll wait for that to dry, and then I'll move on to the tuxedo, the lapels, and the shoes, which will use two different blacks. Now that the shirt and the vest have been masked off with silly putty, it's time to move on to the tuxedo. Now, even though I primed the kit in black, I am giving it a coat of black paint. And that's because black is not always the same. The primer black is different from the paint that I'm using, and I'm going to be using two different blacks, one for the tuxedo cloth itself, and one for the shoes and for the lapels. I want the shoes to have a little bit of a patent leather look, and I want the lapels to appear to be a little shiny, to have a satin sheen to them. So that's why I'm using two different blacks. Looking at my reference photos from the Abbott and Costello film, you notice a sheen on the lapels and of course on the shoes. And so with that in mind, I'm going to change the hue of black, or the value of black, that I'm going to paint on the character. I've used a matte black for the tuxedo, and I've chosen one that has a bit more of a gloss to it to help achieve the sheen of the satin lapels and the patent leather shoes. So the main body is done, and I think it bears repeating that if you're using primarily one color, in this case black, there are ways to make the black more interesting visually. So as I mentioned as I was painting the kit, I used a matte black for the bulk of the jacket and the pants. I used a different black, a detail black, for the lapels, and it's slightly darker than the matte black. I also used it on the shoes. In order to accentuate the difference, I gave a coat of satin top coat to the lapels, to the pocket, and to the shoes, as well as the stripe down the tuxedo pants. And that makes it more visually interesting. I accented the watch chain with some gold, a little bit of silver for the clasp on the cape drawstring. The cape drawstring itself was done quickly with black, and I used a pearl white for the tie, which also then got a quick swipe of a satin top coat, again, just to give it a sheen. I also used the pearl white on the buttons, and again, a little bit of satin top coat on the buttons to differentiate them from the other parts of the waistcoat, the vest, and the shirt. While these will be matte, the buttons themselves will stand out a little bit more. I also did the same thing on the tuxedo jacket with those buttons. They got a satin top coat as well. It's all to make it a little bit more visually interesting. I've decided to start with the cape just to get rid of the clothing so that I can concentrate on the skin afterwards. So I've primed it, as I mentioned earlier, in white because I am going over this in gold. Gold over black would be a tough thing to paint. So the white should make painting the gold a little bit easier. So here we go. The cape is now complete and I'm satisfied with the results. The online references that I was able to find showed the cape lining in gold, and the color that I've painted it is a close approximation to the actual color of the cape. And the color that I used came from Green Stuff World. This is a Eldorado gold color. The dark black for the collar of the cape and for the back of the cape, that comes from the detail black that I used on some of the elements on the tuxedo, the lapels, the stripe on the pants, and the shoes. And that is a detail black in the Woods and Water line from Badger Paints, same people who make Freak Flax. And I also gave the black of the cape a satin finish so that it would hit the light just right. And the satin finish that I used, the satin top coat that I used, this is now no longer in production. This used to come from Garage Kits US, as you can see, but any satin top coat will do. I wouldn't use a gloss top coat. It would look phony, but a satin top coat, I think, gives the right impression. So with the cape now done, it's time to turn our attention to the skin. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I like to begin painting skin with a relatively dark base coat. I like to use a rust as a base coat because it helps create shadows without too much work. So as you can see, I've painted this time in white, or at least I've primed in white. I don't like to always use the same technique. I like to alter what I do from time to time, but I am going to add some shadow in now using a bronze skin tone. So I'll do bronze on most of the face and the hands, especially around the center of the face. So the eyes, nose, mouth, the ears, and I might let it just fade out as we move around the portrait. I'm going to tilt the figure away from me so that I can get under and I can create the shadows in the eyes, in the chin, in the neck, everywhere I need it to be. Now that I've got my darker tone down, it's time to apply a lighter tone from the top down to hit all the high points on the portrait and on the hands. So I'm just going to turn the head away from me. The next thing I do is dial down the pressure on my airbrush. I rock the trigger back and forth, and I spatter some flesh wash on the face to break up the overall color and to add some of the imperfections that we all have in our skin. Some of the specks from the spatter are bigger than I like, so I use a makeup cotton swab to absorb some of the excess paint and to blend it into the face. Next come the washes. I use a blue, yellow, and a red. Blue deadens the skin, while yellow and red warm it back up. Blue is excellent for male figures, especially when it's applied to the beard line, but don't let it sit too long because it stains very quickly. The next step in my process is to mix skin tones using a wet palette. A wet palette is fantastic for model painting. It keeps your acrylic paint wetter longer, it can last days, and it also allows for easy blending. So I mix up a variety of different skin tones all next to each other. The first color I apply is a light tone to cover some of the spatter that's still a little too big and a little too dark for my liking. I blend it into the other light tones on the face. Then I start applying the glazes around the entire portrait, and that's why I've mixed up a variety of different tones. You need a variety of values close at hand as you work your way around the figure. You want red tones at the top of the cheeks, above and below the eyes, on the chin, the tip of the nose, the ears. You want lighter tones on other parts of the face, so do yourself a favor and mix up a variety of glazes. I deepen the shadows around the eyes by mixing a blue-gray color. This is also an excellent color to use in the hairline and in the eyebrows as pre-shading, and on the upper eyelid to create character and to make Dracula look more menacing. The hair is now blocked in with charcoal gray, and it also has streaks of a lighter gray, because when Lugosi shot this movie, he was older. Watch the film and you'll see how different his hair is from his younger days of playing the Count. The eyes are next. One particular aspect of Lugosi's Dracula hypnotic stare is that each eye is positioned differently. He raises his left eyebrow when he does his stare, and that forces a repositioning of his left eye. The upper portion of the iris of his left eye never touches the upper eyelid. There's always a little bit of sclera visible. When it comes to the right eye touches both the upper and the lower lid, or at least the iris of the eye touches both the upper and the lower lid. But on this side, the left side, there's always a little bit of sclera visible at the top. Now with this Billiken kit, the sculptor actually sculpted the correct eye position in, so I don't have to paint it, I just have to follow the guidelines. And I'll begin with the sclera. For the sclera, I like to use an off-white. In this case, I'm using something that was called Ancient Bone, and this was produced by Minotaur. It's just an off creamy white. I like the way it looks, and I've been using this for years. And if you look up references for Lugosi's eyes, you will find that he had blue eyes. So I'm going to begin with the darkest color. If you take a look at your eyes, anyone else's eyes, you'll notice that the outer rim of the iris is always a darker shade of the iris color itself. So I'm going to begin with a very dark blue, especially around the outer portion of the iris, and then a lighter blue on the inside, and then the pupil. Painting striations in eyes at this scale is a real challenge, so what I've done is I've applied tiny, tiny dots of my initial blue color and then a lighter color of the blue all around the eye, just to break up the consistency so that it's not one flat tone of blue. Just a little bit of breakup helps give the eyes a little bit more life, I feel. So the only thing that's left is a little bit of a wash around the eyes so that we see the pink in the corners and a little bit of maybe bloodshot in the eyes, and then it'll be time to reassemble. And here he is, Bela Lugosi from the 1948 comedy classic Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This was a fun kit to do. The skin had its challenges, and working with black as a primary color on the character also came with its own problems to solve. But just because one color dominates, that doesn't mean you can't come up with something that's interesting to look at and has variety. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.